A man walked into a dying town with nothing but a rifle and a debt no one asked him to pay. 3 weeks later, that town was still standing. No one ever wrote down his name. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know who's listening to this story. The man arrived on foot in late September, when the cottonwoods along the creek had started to turn. He wore canvas trousers and a worn shirt, and his hair hung past his shoulders in the way his people had always worn it. He carried a Springfield rifle across his back and a knife at his belt. His boots were nearly worn through. He did not look like someone who intended to stay. He made camp a mile outside the town, near where the creek bent around a stand of willows. He built no fire that first night. He sat against a tree and watched the lights from the town flicker in the distance. The next morning, he walked into the settlement and stood at the edge of the main street for a long time, just watching people move about their business. His name was something the townspeople never learned to pronounce, so they never called him anything at all. Most pretended not to see him. When he walked into the general store to trade a pair of rabbit pelts for coffee and flour, the owner took the pelts without a word and gave him less than they were worth. The man did not argue. He took what was offered and left. He had come to this place because his sister had died here 2 years earlier. She had worked in a laundry at the edge of town, washing clothes for the miners and the saloon. One winter, she had taken ill with pneumonia, and no doctor would come to see her. She died in a room with no heat, and they buried her in ground outside the cemetery fence. He had been trapping in the mountains when it happened. He only learned of it months later from a trader who had passed through. He had not come for revenge. He had come because he needed to see the place where she had spent her final days, to understand what her life had been in this town that would not remember her. He visited the laundry. It was abandoned now, the windows broken and the door hanging loose. He stood inside the empty room where she had worked and tried to imagine her there. Then he visited the spot where she was buried. There was no marker. He gathered stones from the creek and built a small cairn. He intended to leave after that. He had nothing else to keep him there. But on the third day, he saw something that made him stay. A group of men on horseback rode into town just after noon. There were 8 of them, and they moved with the casual authority of people who knew no one would challenge them. They tied their horses outside the saloon and went inside. An hour later, they came out, and one of them grabbed a woman who was walking past. She tried to pull away. He laughed and pushed her against the wall of the building. No one on the street moved to help her. The man finally let her go, and she hurried away, keeping her head down. The native man watched this from across the street. He saw the fear in the woman's face. He saw the way everyone else looked away. He recognized something in that moment, something he had seen before in other places. This town was dying not from lack of water or crops or gold, but from fear. He went back to his camp that evening and thought about leaving. It was not his town. These were not his people. He owed them nothing. But he kept thinking about his sister, alone and sick, and how no one had helped her. He wondered if she had been afraid, if she had looked for help that never came. By morning, he had decided. The town sat in a shallow valley where 2 creeks came together. It had grown up around a silver mine 3 years earlier, and when the silver ran thin, most people left. Those who remained were the ones with nowhere else to go. There were maybe 200 people living in the cluster of wooden buildings. A single main street ran north to south with a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, and a handful of other structures. The sheriff had left the previous spring, and no one had replaced him. The men on horseback were part of a larger group that controlled most of the territory. They moved between towns, taking what they wanted. They demanded payment from store owners. They stole livestock. They harassed anyone who resisted. In some places, they had burned buildings and killed those who stood against them. They had learned that fear was more effective than violence, though they used violence whenever fear was not enough. The town had no marshal, no mayor with any real authority, and no organized defense. A few men owned rifles, but none were willing to use them. Those who spoke up were beaten or run out. The rest learned to keep quiet and hoped they would be overlooked. It was easier to survive by bending. The native man understood this. He had seen it in his own people, the way survival sometimes meant swallowing pride and anger. But he also knew that fear, left unchecked, would consume everything. His sister had lived in this fear, and it had killed her as surely as the pneumonia. He could not bring her back, but he could do something she had not been able to do. He could refuse to be invisible. He began by watching. He learned the patterns of the men who rode into town. They came every 2 weeks, usually 8 or 9 of them, always in the afternoon. They stayed for a few hours, collected what they called protection money from the store owners, drank at the saloon, and left before dark. They had a camp somewhere in the hills to the west, but no one knew exactly where. The man also watched the townspeople. He saw which ones were angry beneath their fear. He saw which ones looked away because they felt helpless, and which ones looked away because they had chosen not to care. He learned who grew vegetables behind their houses, who repaired wagon wheels, who knew how to shoe horses. He listened to conversations in the store. He learned that most people wanted the riders gone, but no one believed it was possible. On a cold morning in early October, the native man walked into the general store and spoke to the owner. He asked if the owner wanted help. The owner stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head and told him to leave. The man left without argument. He tried again 2 days later with the blacksmith. The blacksmith listened but said nothing. The man could see the doubt in his face, the instinct to reject help from someone the town had been taught to mistrust. He did not push. He simply nodded and walked away. He spent his evenings preparing. He scouted the hills around the town. He found vantage points, places where the land gave an advantage. He cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition. He repaired his boots with leather scraps. He did all of this quietly, without drawing attention. The riders came again on a Thursday. This time, one of them hit a man outside the saloon, accusing him of holding back money. The man fell and did not get up quickly enough, so the rider kicked him. A small crowd gathered, but no one intervened. The native man stood at the far end of the street and watched. That night, he followed the riders when they left town. He stayed far enough back that they did not notice him. He tracked them for 6 miles into the hills until they reached their camp. He counted 14 men total. He watched their camp for 2 hours, memorizing the layout, noting where they kept their horses and supplies. Then he slipped away before dawn. 3 days passed. The man continued his routine, visiting the creek, hunting small game, staying mostly out of sight. But he also began doing small things around the town. He fixed a broken fence behind the boarding house. He cleared debris from the ditch that carried water from the creek. He did these things early in the morning, before most people were awake. No one thanked him. Most did not acknowledge him at all. On the 4th day, a boy approached him near the creek. The boy was perhaps 12, thin and serious. He asked the man if he was going to fight the riders. The man asked why the boy thought that. The boy said he had seen him watching, and he had seen him fix things, and that his mother said only someone planning to stay would bother fixing things. The man told the boy he had not decided. The boy nodded and started to leave, then turned back. He said his father had tried to stand up to the riders the year before. They had beaten him badly, and he had never been the same since. He said his mother was afraid all the time now. The boy did not ask for anything. He just wanted the man to know. The man thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. He had told himself he was staying to honor his sister, to do something she could not. But the truth was more complicated. He was staying because he was tired of watching people suffer, while pretending he could not see it. He was staying because doing nothing felt worse than the danger of acting. The riders returned the following week. This time, there were 9 of them. They rode in fast and loud, firing pistols into the air. They went into the saloon and demanded free drinks. The owner complied. When they left an hour later, one of them noticed the native man standing near the general store. The rider walked his horse over and looked down at him. The rider asked what he was doing there. The man said nothing. The rider told him to move along, that his kind was not welcome. The man met his eyes but did not move. The rider reached for his pistol, then seemed to think better of it. He spat on the ground near the man's feet and rode away laughing. After they were gone, the store owner came outside. He told the man he had been foolish to provoke them. The man said he had not provoked anyone. He had simply stood where he was standing. The owner shook his head and went back inside. That night, the man made his decision. He could not defeat 14 armed men in open combat. He was one person with one rifle. But he could make their life difficult enough that they would choose to go elsewhere. He could disrupt their routine, create uncertainty, make them feel hunted instead of hunters. He started small. He found where they kept their horses when they came to town and scattered caltrops made from sharpened wood along the trail they used to leave. The next time they rode out, 3 horses went lame. The men had to walk them back slowly, cursing and confused. The following week, he waited in the hills above the trail and fired a single shot from concealment when the riders passed below. The bullet struck a rock near the lead horse, spooking it. The riders scattered and took cover, but they saw no one. They fired wildly into the trees for several minutes. When they realized there was no follow-up, they regrouped and continued to town, but their ease was gone. He varied his tactics. Sometimes he did nothing, letting them arrive without incident. Other times, he created small obstacles, a deadfall across the trail, or stones rolled down from above as they passed. He never showed himself. He never gave them a target. He just made them nervous. The riders increased their numbers. 12 men came instead of 9, then 15. They rode with rifles out, scanning the hills, but that made them slower and more cautious. The town noticed the change. People began to whisper that someone was fighting back. The native man knew this could not last. Eventually, the riders would decide the town was more trouble than it was worth, or they would organize a proper hunt and track him down. He was counting on the former, but he also knew he was risking not just his own life, but the town's. If the riders decided to retaliate against the townspeople, he would be responsible. In late October, something changed. The store owner approached him one morning and asked to speak privately. They walked to the edge of town, near the creek. The owner said he had been thinking about what the man was doing. He said it was brave but dangerous. He said the town could not afford to make the riders angry. The man asked what the owner thought would happen if things continued as they were. The owner admitted that eventually the town would collapse. People were already leaving. Those who stayed lived in fear. But he said angering the riders would bring immediate violence, whereas slow decline felt survivable. The man asked if the owner would rather die slowly than risk dying quickly. The owner had no answer to that. 2 days later, the riders came in force. 20 men on horseback, all armed. They rode through the town slowly, their faces hard. They stopped in the middle of the main street, and the leader shouted that he knew someone had been harassing them. He said if the person did not step forward, they would burn the town. The native man stood near the general store, watching. He could feel the weight of the moment. He could step forward and end this, accept whatever they would do to him. Or he could stay silent and see if the threat was real. Before he could decide, the blacksmith stepped into the street. He said there was no one person responsible. He said the riders had made enemies of everyone in town through their actions, and that it was only a matter of time before people fought back. He said the town would not be burned, because the riders needed towns like this. Without them, they had nowhere to take their stolen goods, nowhere to resupply. The leader of the riders stared at the blacksmith for a long moment. Then he drew his pistol and shot him in the chest. The blacksmith fell. The leader said that was what happened to people who talked back. Then he and his men rode out. The town carried the blacksmith to the doctor's house, but he died before sunset. People were angry and afraid in equal measure. Some blamed the blacksmith for provoking the riders. Others said the riders had finally shown their true nature. The native man felt the weight of the blacksmith's death. He had not pulled the trigger, but his actions had set events in motion. He considered leaving that night. Instead, he went to the blacksmith's widow and offered his condolences. She looked at him with hollow eyes and asked if he would finish what her husband had started. He did not answer. He spent the next day thinking. Violence had failed to cow the town, but it had also shown the riders' desperation. They were afraid of losing control, that fear could be used. He needed to force them into a position where leaving was preferable to staying. He scouted their camp again, moving through the hills in darkness. He watched for 2 nights, learning their routine. He saw that they kept most of their supplies in a single tent. He saw that they posted guards, but the guards were lazy and inattentive. He saw that their leaders slept in a tent at the far end of the camp. On the 3rd night, he moved in close. He waited until the guards were at the farthest point of their patrol, then slipped into the camp. He went to the supply tent and set a slow-burning fuse made from oil-soaked cloth. He was back in the trees before it caught. When the tent went up in flames, the camp erupted in chaos. Men ran to put out the fire while others grabbed weapons and fired blindly into the darkness. The native man was already a mile away. The next morning, riders came to the town. But they did not threaten or swagger. They looked tired and angry. They went into the saloon and stayed there for hours. When they left, they did not collect any money. They just rode out. The man learned later that the fire had destroyed most of their ammunition and food supplies. Replacing them would take time and money. More importantly, it had shaken their confidence. They were not untouchable. He continued his campaign. He poisoned their water supply with bitter herbs that caused cramps and sickness. He stole their horses one by one, releasing them far from camp. He left signs of his presence, a single feather tied to a branch, a cairn of stones at the entrance to their camp. He wanted them to know they were being hunted. By mid-November, the riders stopped coming to the town. People waited nervously for retaliation, but none came. A week passed, then 2. Slowly, cautiously, the town began to breathe again. The store owner reopened his ledger and noted that he had not paid protection money in a month. The boarding house owner repaired her front porch. The boy whose mother had been afraid began playing in the street again. Life resumed in small, hesitant increments. The native man watched this from a distance. He still camped near the creek. He still kept to himself. But now, occasionally, someone would nod to him when he passed. The store owner gave him fair value for his pelts. The boy's mother baked bread and left it outside his camp one morning. Then, in early December, a U.S. Marshal arrived in town. He was an older man with a gray mustache and a tired face. He asked questions about the riders and was told they had stopped coming. He asked why. People gave vague answers. Someone mentioned that a stranger had been living near the town, but when the marshal asked to speak with him, no one knew where to find him. The marshal investigated for 3 days. He rode out to the riders' camp and found it abandoned. He spoke with people in neighboring towns and learned that the riders had moved north toward the territorial line. Satisfied, he returned to the town and announced that the threat was over. He said the riders had been driven out by the determination of the townspeople to resist. He filed a report crediting the town's courage and the arrival of territorial law enforcement. He mentioned no individuals. The newspapers that picked up the story praised the resilience of frontier communities and the effectiveness of the marshal's intervention. The native man read one of those articles when a copy of the paper arrived at the general store. He felt no anger at the omission. He had not acted for recognition. But he wondered if his sister would have appreciated the irony that the town she had lived in, the town that had let her die alone, was now being celebrated for bravery it had not shown. In late December, the first snow fell. The man decided it was time to leave. He had done what he came to do. His sister's grave was marked, The town would survive. There was nothing else to keep him. On his last morning, he packed his few belongings and walked through the town one final time. He stopped at the place where his sister had been buried and stood there for several minutes. Then he walked north, following the creek into the hills. The boy saw him leaving and ran after him. He asked where the man was going. The man said he was going home. The boy asked if he would come back. The man said he did not think so. The boy thanked him, then ran back to town. By spring, new families had moved into the town. The buildings were repaired. A new sheriff was appointed. The saloon did better business. People spoke sometimes of the winter when the riders had left, but the details grew hazy. No one could quite agree on why the riders had stopped coming. Some said it was the weather. Others said the riders had simply moved on to easier targets. The blacksmith's widow knew differently. So did the store owner and the boy and a few others. But they did not speak of it often, and when they did, they were careful not to say too much. It felt safer that way, as if speaking the truth might somehow undo what had been done. Years later, when the town had grown into a proper settlement with a school and a church, a historian came through collecting stories. He asked about the town's early days, about the troubles with outlaws. People told him about the marshal who had driven the riders away. They told him about the blacksmith who had stood up to the outlaws and died for it. No one mentioned the native man who had camped by the creek. The historian wrote his account based on what he was told. It became the official history. The blacksmith got a memorial. The marshal's name appeared in books. The town celebrated its survival as proof of American courage and frontier justice. But sometimes, late at night, the store owner would sit on his porch and look toward the creek. He would remember a man with a rifle and worn boots, a man who had asked for nothing and been given less, a man who had saved them all and then walked away into the snow. He would wonder where that man had gone, whether he was still alive, whether he ever thought about the town he had saved. The truth was written in stones piled beside an unmarked grave, in the quiet way fear had lifted from people's faces, in the survival of a place that should have died. It was a truth that required no monument, no official record, no historian's validation. It simply was. Sometimes the most important acts are the ones no one remembers to write down, and the truest courage is the kind that expects nothing in return.